interfaces and the possibilities for communities and their leaders to renegotiate the margin of communal land control. And this brings me, as a final reflection to the 21st century, to understand how these communities did not just persist. It's important to understand what's actually happening today in these territories, where as commodity frontiers appear to be exhausted at the global level, the implication is that those communal lands are being enclosed again in remote, that communal lands in remote areas are again being enclosed in particularly these regions that were deemed less suitable for capitalist development. In other words, apparently forgotten and particularly indigenous communally governed territories are being reopened. In the concrete case of the Altiplano, we are observing a new mining boom pushed forward by new transnational actors, new technologies which are way more sophisticated but ecologically more impacting, and new legal frameworks which seem to be a repetition of those 19th century anti-communitarian liberal land reforms. To go closing, to understand what's new about these frontiers and what do they mean for these supposedly last surviving free zones, we need to take the historical shaping of these zones and of these frontiers more seriously. Marginal communities that seem to have been overlooked by globalizing land regimes, in fact, actively negotiated that position and are currently renegotiating that position. So they have to be understood rather as the product of sustained frontier dynamics. And in that sense, rather than survival, we have to read these communal spaces as the lever that converts incorporation into negotiated processes, which means that these new frontiers also seldom are really new, but have a longer trajectory of negotiation and resistance. And well, I think I go closing there. I want to. What my challenge now with my research is mainly to understand how what's the role of the state in understanding these historical and new frontiers, which apparently seem to change the condition and when a commodity frontier can be produced or not, or what are the conditions for commodity frontiers recreation. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Justin McBrien. Actually, our PowerPoint got kind of strange, so I'm going to just download it again. Let's see.
Did you find it once you downloaded it? Yeah. Okay, so it's right here. It downloaded right there. Yeah.
Update issue.
Oh, just hit cancel.
Okay.
And then enable editing so that you can go to viewpoint. Okay.
Yeah.
And Wendy, we can run the session 10, 15 minutes over time.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, how's it going? I am Justin McBrien from the University of Virginia. On the border of the Ikaria Apache Reservation in the Karsten National Forest in northwest New Mexico, there is a meadow in which prairie dogs roam and wild horses graze, a place so seemingly bucolic and naturally innocent that if not for this tombstone and a few concrete embankments, it would be impossible to know that on December 10th, 1967, the Atomic Energy Commission and El Paso Natural Gas Corporation exploded a 29-kiloton nuclear bomb below the surface of this prairie dog colony. This would be the first nuclear fracking test of 3 in the 1960s and early 1970s. And nuclear fracking sites, in fact, are unique in that out of almost 1,000 nuclear tests in the continental US, they're the only ones you can actually visit somewhat. You may have to break into one of them, but nevertheless, generally they are still accessible to the general public. However, there are yellow signs warning, please do not dig below the surface, but obviously the prairie dogs did not heed that warning. Now, though nuclear fracking may seem some kind of macabre curiosity of a bygone era, I seek to show that, in fact, a tortuous path leads from nuclear fracking to the present-day pipeline fights, for instance, the Dakota Access Pipeline. For nuclear fracking, in fact, represented an opening salvo and a gambit to create a new commodity frontier for American capital at a moment of an imminent crisis in its energy production. This sometimes cooperative, sometimes antagonistic relationship between nuclear energy and natural gas extraction saw many different forms from the 60s to present. First antagonistically in the fight over the future of energy, and then cooperatively in the case of using nuclear weapons to frack for natural gas. And then finally, ambivalently in a tragic history of the late 80s and early 90s in which environmentalists would in fact promote natural gas as a clean alternative to other fossil fuels, which would in turn allow for the fracking boom of the 2000s and again the rise of the pipeline fights that we see have intensified so much today. And indeed, if we were to say there's a ground zero of what I refer to as the Necrocenic accumulation of capitalism, I would say that this gravestone of a tomb depicting the deep time death birthed from a nuclear weapon meant to kill millions in order to extract dead matter for profit, which is now driving an extinction event, I felt this would be an appropriate symbol to discuss what I referred to as the Necrocene. And for me, the Necrocene is the idea of capital becoming an extinction event rather than humanity becoming a geological epoch. And to define the Necrocene, it is, in a way, capitalism should be conceived as almost a species, a disaster taxon, an invasive parasite, if you will, that must operate upon necrosis in order to accumulate. And it's not just the extinction of species, it is that of peoples, languages, cultures, and not just of human cultures and languages, but that of birds, cetaceans. It is an overall totality of extinction at both the level of peoples, cultures, and the biosphere. Now, I would like to talk about natural fracking in terms of the idea of what I call the kind of process of Necrocene accumulation through extermination, extraction, and extinction. The first is the violent dispossession of peoples and the extermination of their local communities and cultures in order to appropriate land and labor for commodification. The second is the necrotic extraction of resources, most generally mining, logging, and drilling, from which surplus is extracted through the destruction and toxification of local ecologies. And the third is the macro-spatial temporal process of deep time erasure of life born from this accumulation of extinction, which we now see in climate change and the larger macro event that we refer to as the sixth extinction. Now, in a way, when we talk about commodity frontiers, we see a kind of shift in this time period from what was the search for cheap natures of the Capitalist's kind of productivist aspect to now a point in which the ability to intensify production was at the cost of losing its ability to produce. Now, for me, if there is a boundary event of the Necrocene, it would be on July 16th, 1945, in which the first nuclear test was detonated at Alamogordo in New Mexico. And it is used actually in the Anthropocene's kind of idea of, golden spikes as one of the big markers of the supposed transition to a human-dominated geology. Now, global fallout, though, born from nuclear testing, though in the Anthropocene is depicted as a kind of uniform layer across the globe, in fact, is mostly concentrated in sites in the South Pacific, the American Southwest, and the Arctic Circle, and in areas either in indigenous territories or on the border of reservations. Now, The first post-war nuclear test was Operation Crossroads, and this, I would say, marked the beginning of the extermination of indigenous lands through the ruinization of nuclear testing. Here, it was at the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific, new areas of American domination after World War II, which saw the Pacific and polar regions as empty spaces devoid of humanity. And indeed, the justification for the expulsion of the Bikinians from their lands was the idea, in fact, that it was for the sake of the good of humanity and not to test whether the American Navy could withstand a nuclear attack. And indeed, they justified this expulsion by saying they were being moved to newer and safer homes. However, these homes were, their original home was not safe because they were going to blow up a nuclear weapon there, right? So at the same time, they believed that there, as I quote one of the Atomic Energy Commissioners, we emphasize our love of peace, justice, general prosperity. King Judah, the head of the Bikinians, doesn't doubt us for a moment. We look so honest. Indeed, we are honest. The very honesty of this nation's passion makes it hard to explain ourselves to King Judah. And indeed, I don't know if it was so hard. He seemed to have an understanding of what was going on, because when he asked Admiral Parsons, one of the task force leaders, why, if it was not dangerous, they are testing 5,000 miles from the U.S., Parsons simply laughed as if this was some sort of absurd question. But there, as you can see, the kind of attitude of the Americans is almost grotesque. I mean, it's like, the difference between what we see here and there is disgusting to me. And it gets worse over time. We first see in the first hydrogen bomb, it was really a device, but first fusion test, the evaporation of an island, which again was something that is the total obliteration and extermination of indigenous lands in the South Pacific to the point of erasing an entire island. Now, at the same time, though, this kind of worry of global fallout starts getting kind of more popularized after yet another test of Bikini, which was the largest thermonuclear test we in the U.S. have ever performed. Which ended up drifting much further than the kind of fallout hazard zone, poisoned a lot of Japanese sailors, and rained down on the Marshallese. But this also made Americans, particularly suburban white Americans, very concerned about the kind of long-term accumulative genetic effects of fallout, leading to these kinds of very innocuous sort of protest citizen science efforts, like the Baby Tooth Survey, which collected nearly 300,000 teeth from children from 1958 to 1962. Now that there is kind of this, the hazard of fallout was seen through the face of a white suburban child, the government begins to pay attention more. And how they respond is a kind of PR whitewashing of nuclear testing, which is called, oh my God, which is called Project Plowshare, which was an attempt to use nuclear weapons for wide-scale excavations, like canals, which of course, again, ran through indigenous territories. As you can see here, this is kind of the proposal for how they would dig a new Panama Canal using, I believe, 15 nuclear weapons.
That was wrong.
Huh? I was gonna say, that seemed, what is it now? Not 5.
11.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was like, how did that happen? No problem. As you can see, another area proposed for the Inupiat Indians was going to be a harbor excavated with 5 hydrogen bombs. This actually met intense opposition by the Inupiat Indian, Native Americans and the kind of low-level AEC biologists who were arguing this was an absurd test whose risks were unnecessary and there was no justification for having a harbor there. At the time, this would be before the Alaskan oil boom. You can also see how nuclear weapons become more entangled with the everyday production of fossil fuels in our kind of petrocultures through things like highway excavation. Indeed, attempts, proposals even to mitigate smog using nuclear bombs. The only problem was the surface temperature would be about 110 degrees. But most importantly, the proposal to use nuclear bombs to frack was something that was not proposed by the Atomic Energy Commission, though considered, but in fact by corporations. And at this time, corporations, of course, had no connection to nuclear bombs. It was completely the monopoly of the state and the Atomic Energy Commission. So this represented a new kind of corporate-state partnership in which funds through taxpayer dollars and the creation of nuclear bombs would be used for private gain of oil and natural gas companies. Now, the Rocky Mountain basins, which is what they were coveting, was an area that for a long time they knew had a lot of natural gas. However, it was in tight shale formations that were very difficult to extract, and up until this time, the technology was not really available to do so. However, the giant in the earth, as this pamphlet distributed to most of the congressmen on the Joint Commission for Atomic Energy was concerned, nuclear weapons were going to open this new commodity frontier. This is kind of the depiction of how it would work. I will not get into the technical details of that right now, but as you can see, the proposed area right here is, again, literally on the border of the Ikaria Apache Reservation. This road is not as improved as I thought when I went down it, but nevertheless, we have here kind of argument PR campaign by the Atomic Energy Commission in which things very patronizing terms like superstitious, for instance, marked what they supposedly characterized as the Ikaria Reservation's reaction to these tests. However, if you look at a lot of these articles and read between the lines, this unconcern did not seem to translate into statements and behaviors of the Ikaria. For instance, the chairman of the tribal council said people are going to leave town that day, people plan to close shops. There's a complaint that they worried that there would be earthquakes triggered by this, in which one Atomic Energy Commissioner laughed and said, if that was the case, Texas and Oklahoma would be shaking all the time, which, as we are generally aware, Oklahoma gets about 300 earthquakes now a year, so they in fact had a good intuition about that. Nevertheless, the tribal police chief, in fact, closed down twice the area recommended, and when the AC pointed out this was not necessary, he responded, you do what you want to do outside, and I'll do what I want to do inside the reservation. So this seemed less kind of cooperative than these articles depicted. Now, the next test, though, led to wide-scale uproar. But, however, this was Project Rulison in 1969, and it was in an area mostly populated by white ranchers in Colorado on the western slope. And 2 ACLU injunctions to stop the tests were filed. They failed. Nevertheless, it kind of was a moment in which a lot of environmentalists came together to renew a strong anti-nuclear campaign, which would move through the 1970s, lead to kind of the demise of reactor development and Project Plowshare in 1974. And this person, John Goffman, was one of the atomic energy researchers who kind of defected and joined ranks of the environmentalists and kind of brought this kind of secret monopoly of knowledge with him. Now, nevertheless, after nuclear fracking ended, natural gas fracking obviously did not, and the subsidization that developed due to natural gas production started going into other areas, particularly Alaska, in which during the 1970s there was a huge oil and gas boom, and soon, suddenly these kind of ideas of huge pipelines began developing to move this product down to the West Coast and over also into the East Coast. Now, the oil pipeline was successfully constructed, but not the liquefied natural gas pipeline, due again to indigenous peoples and environmental advocates' resistance. So by the late 1970s, a lot of the natural gas exploration subsidized in the late 1960s started kind of declining. A lot of this also had to do with the rising oil glut of the 1980s. While natural gas production and subsidization declined, environmentalists simultaneously started looking toward natural gas production and fracking and kind of reversed course in the late 1980s. This had a lot to do with the rise of concerns about greenhouse gases and the kind of, Jim Hansen in 1988 gave his famous speech in front of Congress talking about global warming as an imminent threat. Now, a lot of environmentalists in the kind of rising neoliberal area, third way thing of the Clintonian time period saw market solutions, as the best opportunity to kind of switch to renewables. And so the discourse of a bridge to renewables, of a clean fossil fuel alternative crept into discourse at this time through organizations like the Environmental Defense, the EDF, and the Sierra Club. Now, the irony of this, again, was that they had not really kind of factored in the other externalities of natural gas fracking. Now, that included, of course, pipeline construction, the leaching of what would be soon used slick water and its various chemicals into the water table, the earthquakes we now see that having developed, the methane releases. All that was seen was carbon intensity and how lower of an emission natural gas might have been compared to other dirtier fossil fuels, but they looked at none of the other externalities, and a lot of that had, of course, to do with their own myopia. And so again, we see in the early 2000s another fracking